Episode 6 Locusts and Fleas. Last time, we finally got to the proclamation of the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, took power, and at least in Hanoi and in the northern half of the country, people rallied behind the Viet Minh, meaning the youth, the old, the woman, the civil servant, everybody was shouting Độc lập, that means independence, I hope I'm saying it right, and rallied behind the Viet Minh. According to one witness, whose name is Philippe Grandjean, a French lawyer who saw Independence Day on Badin Square back then, the ceremony of independence went like clockwork. It was so well organized and orderly that you wonder how the Viet Minh had pulled it off. Considering that only 2 weeks before, they were heading a revolutionary mob around Hanoi. It was proof of the Viet Minh's ability to mobilize, but also to organize, even on a tight schedule as they had. Remember, Ho Chi Minh had rushed into declaring independence after the Potsdam Conference. He wanted to present the international community with the fait accompli. We are here. You've got to deal with us. What we'll see today is that by declaring independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, that we'll call the DRV from now on, by declaring independence, the Viet Minh put itself in the middle of an extremely dangerous game. The main players here were the big three at the end of World War II, meaning the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK. France did not sit at the high rollers table anymore, but the French had their own Ho Chi Minh in the person of the General Charles de Gaulle. After defeat against the Germans in 1940, de Gaulle had refused to surrender and became the leader of Free France. In 1945, he badly wanted to restore France to its pre-war status, and he wanted to sit at the same table as the big three. For that to happen, though, it was necessary to keep the colonial empire intact, starting with the jewel of said empire, Indochina. For that purpose, de Gaulle had the support of Churchill, the British Prime Minister. But what he really needed was American backing. And in 1945, that was not a guarantee. And yeah, one other problem. Ho Chi Minh was standing in the way. The situation in Vietnam was dealt with by the big three at the Potsdam Conference that concluded on August 2nd, 1945. At Potsdam, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill did not even bother asking de Gaulle what he thought. The big three decided that to disarm the Japanese army in Vietnam, they would send the Chinese Nationalist forces north of the 16th parallel and the British army south of that parallel. And that is why Ho Chi Minh, as I said, rushed to proclaim independence. He wanted to tell the Chinese and the British, "Welcome guys, nice to see you, but you should not have bothered, really. Look, everything is fine. We're in charge. We have a government supported by the people. We fought the Japanese, unlike those French cowards, and even America supports us. As a matter of fact, let me introduce you to Major Patty, my friend." His hope by doing that was that the US, and therefore the Allies, would recognize his government and prevent the return of the French. So let's talk about the French. As I said last week, and for the reasons I outlined a minute ago around restoring the grandeur of France, a French expeditionary army was sailing to take back Indochina. France has to take back its colony. Of course, de Gaulle thought he had to make concessions and implement political, social, and economic reforms. Natives, for example, needed to be given political representation. But surely that would be enough, right? This vision, de Gaulle had outlined it in the Brazzaville Declaration in 1944. The declaration included the end of the special legal restrictions that apply to natives but not to white people, the establishment of elected territorial assemblies, and representation in Paris in a new French federation. However, independence was explicitly rejected as a future possibility. So reforms, yes; independence, no. And that was also clear in de Gaulle's declaration on Indochina, issued on March 24, 1945, just a few days after the Japanese coup. In it, de Gaulle committed to the creation of an Indo-Chinese federation of 5 states. I repeat, states, not colonies, not protectorates. Cambodia, Laos, Cochinchina, Annam, and Tonkin became states, which, by the way, was what Bao Dai was demanding in 1931. These 5 states would be part of the French Union of Indochina, headed by a governor-general appointed by Paris. The French and de Gaulle were confident that this would work. And I cannot help but think here, and this is not a valid comparison at all, of the Vietnam War in 1965, when Lyndon Baines Johnson, the US president, tried a diplomatic approach with North Vietnam and said, quote, "Old Ho can't turn me down," end quote. But as you know, Ho did. In 1945, de Gaulle must have thought the Vietnamese can turn me down. But they did turn down French concessions. Why? Because it was too little too late. The Vietnamese had asked for this in 1931, and they could not just understand what the French were on about with their reforms and their federation and stuff. We independent now, what do they think? De Gaulle's declaration was willfully blind and did not even mention the Empire of Vietnam proclaimed by Bao Dai after the Japanese coup. The second reason why the Vietnamese didn't understand the Indochina Declaration is that de Gaulle was acting as if there were actual French troops on the ground, as if the Japanese had not erased French administrative and military power on March the 9th. And even Bao Dai said so in an address in 1945. Quote, "I want to talk now to the people of France, the country of my youth. I also want to talk to its leader and liberator, and I want to talk as a friend rather than as a head of state. You have suffered too much during 4 deadly years not to understand that the Vietnamese people no longer want, can no longer bear any domination of foreign administration. You would understand even better if you could see what is happening here, if you could see this desire for independence. Even if you managed to establish the French administration, it would no longer be obeyed." And Bao Dai concluded, "We could so easily get along and become friends if you would stop pretending to become our masters," end quote. But the French did want to become masters again. There was no doubt about that. To prepare for their return, they decided to replace Bao Dai with, wait for it, the former Emperor Duy Tan. You remember Duy Tan, right? As an emperor, he led a rebellion against the French in 1916. He failed and was exiled to Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean. In 1939, Duy Tan joined the Free French Forces and fought with distinction as a French commissioned officer. In 1945, because Duy Tan was still popular in Vietnamese memory for his patriotism, de Gaulle talked to him about returning to Vietnam as an emperor. Alas, Duy Tan died in a plane crash on his way home to Vietnam, and the great hopes of the French died with him. The other headache for de Gaulle and the French was the United States. The problem here was that Roosevelt, the US president, hated de Gaulle's guts and just could not trust the general. But luckily for de Gaulle, Roosevelt died in April 1945. And suddenly, here was an opportunity to reset the relationship between France and the US. That reset was made possible as well by Harry Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt. Truman was much more willing to listen to the French because his top priority was to counter the Soviet Union in Europe. And for that, he needed France to stand as tall and powerful as possible in the whole continent. Therefore, if de Gaulle wanted to reestablish French Indochina, Truman said that the US would not stand in the way. And at the same time that is happening, Ho Chi Minh sent many letters to Truman, and they all went unanswered. That's why when Ho Chi Minh's American friend Major Patty landed in Hanoi for Independence Day in September 1945, he brought with him Jean Saint-Denis, de Gaulle's envoy for northern Vietnam, what the French call Tonkin. This was extremely worrying news for Ho Chi Minh, of course. However, for the time being, the Viet Minh was firmly in control in Hanoi, and Saint-Denis could do nothing but watch Ho Chi Minh declare independence on September 2nd. However, the Viet Minh has a massive Achilles heel, and that was Saigon. Saigon and the southern region is where the French would be given an opportunity to get back in the game by the British. It was really a tale of two cities in October 1945 between Saigon and Hanoi. While the Viet Minh had Hanoi running like clockwork, the situation in Saigon was a hot mess after the Japanese surrender. On September the 2nd, Independence Day, 5 French people were killed and dozens wounded, their homes invaded and ransacked in violent anti-French riots. Saigon's French community was under siege, and there were riots and confrontations all over the city between various Vietnamese factions. The thing was that the Viet Minh was not in charge in Saigon as it was in Hanoi. It had to share power with other factions within a community for Nam Bo, Nam Bo being southern Vietnam. So the community for the south included communists, Trotskyists, the Hoa Hao and Cao Dai religious groups, as well as a mafia-like group called the Binh Duyen. So no surprise that it was chaos in Saigon, because these guys did not agree on anything apart from being independent. The communists wanted to get rid of the Trotskyists and the sects, but these guys had armed militias ready to fight, and the Binh Duyen thugs roamed the city doing whatever they pleased. In short, it was anarchy in Saigon, and that was the situation when the British troops landed in September 1945 as mandated by the Potsdam Conference. The British commander was the General Gracie, and his task was to disarm the Japanese forces. Now, you may be thinking, okay, the British are here and they're going to put an end to the pandemonium. Nope, quite the opposite. General Gracie even added fuel to the fire burning in the city. To understand why, you got to know that General Gracie was born to English parents in India, and he had served his whole career in the Indian colonial army. So this is a guy whose worldview was the same as the French colonists. White people give orders, and Asians execute, and that's that. Therefore, the way Gracie interpreted his mission was to disarm the Japanese and wait for the French to return to hand them back the reins. And the last thing Gracie wanted was to deal with the rabble at the Committee for the South. These guys had no legitimacy in the eyes of the English general. So what did he do? One of his first decisions was to free the French colonial soldiers who had been languishing in prison since the Japanese coup in March. Not only did Gracie free the French soldiers, but he also gave them weapons to help him keep order in town. So here you have French soldiers who had been humiliated by the Japanese, who had just spent 6 months in prison being taunted by the Vietnamese. What do they do as soon as they're out? Well, they went on a rampage aided and abetted by French civilians, they attacked and killed any Vietnamese they saw. The situation in Saigon became even more dangerous than it was before, with one difference. The English had given a leg up to the French, and the French went after the Vietnamese. So on September 23rd, taking advantage of the British support, Jean Sédil, who was de Gaulle representative for the south of Vietnam, Jean Sédil drove the Committee of the South out of all administrative buildings and reoccupied them in the name of the French Republic. The Vietnamese responded with the general strike, and fighting resumed between Vietnamese and French that led to unprecedented violence in Saigon. The most appalling episode was the Cité Héros massacre on 24th and 25th of September. What happened there is that dozens of Vietnamese assailants took some 300 European and Eurasian civilians as hostages, including women and children. Many of the hostages, especially the Métis, which mean the Eurasians, were horribly mutilated, tortured, beaten, raped, and killed. In another incident, Lieutenant Colonel Dewey, who was the OSS representative in Saigon, so the OSS is the precursor of the CIA. Well, Colonel Dewey was killed at a checkpoint and his body was never found. This was the first American casualty in Vietnam. And many historians consider that the Indochina War began there in Saigon and then on the 23rd, 24th, 25th of September 1945. So the situation at the end of September in Saigon was that the arrival of the British forces had basically started the war between the French and the Vietnamese. General Gracie had to find a way to put an end to the mess he had helped create. After multiple attempts, negotiations, the English general managed to get the French and the Committee of the South to sign a precarious ceasefire. However, the ink on the ceasefire agreement was barely dry, and then the first soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps landed in Saigon. And this was a game changer. Not only the French had the British backing, but they also now had a proper army in Saigon. So when General Philippe Leclerc, who led the French Expeditionary Corps, arrived, all the French people came out in torrential rain to welcome the Messiah who had come to save them from the Viets. Leclerc's mission was simple: to reconquer Cochinchine, meaning the south of Vietnam. So as soon as he arrived, Leclerc started collaborating with Gracie, and both generals decided to work together to get rid of the Committee of the South. The Anglo-French troops, backed by Japanese soldiers, launched an offensive and drove out of Saigon all the independence fighters, the Viet Minh and all their friends from the Committee of the South. After that, Leclerc's troops spread in the countryside, and between September and December 1945, the French reconquered all the cities of the South. France was back. But Leclerc was not done, and he said, quote, "Nothing is finished. France must regain its place in the North too, especially in Hanoi, where the key to the South problems lie." End quote. So back to Hanoi we go. We left in early September 1945, and while the French military advance was a cause for concern, another headache was unfolding for Ho Chi Minh's DRV in the north. To be precise, it is a double headache caused not only by Chinese occupation, but also by the return of rival nationalist parties. A few days after September the 2nd, more than 150,000 Chinese nationalist soldiers, under the command of General Lu Han, entered the Vietnamese capital. And this was a hard pill to swallow for the Vietnamese, to see their historical enemy come back and occupy their land by force. Unsurprisingly, they had nothing positive to say about the Chinese soldiers. Here's what General Vo Nguyen Giap had to say, for example. Quote, "It was hard to believe that this was an army. Dismayed looks, filthy, tattered uniforms, a whole mess of junk on their shoulders. They appeared like rust in the city that had just been cleared of colonialist filth." End quote. But it wasn't just their appearance that worried Ho Chi Minh and his government. Officially, the Chinese were in northern Vietnam to receive the Japanese surrender and to keep order until a new administration could take over. But which administration? A French one? A Vietnamese one? It was all up in the air. Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of Nationalist China and a US ally, wanted to influence events to his advantage if he could. Therefore, he kept his options open. On the one hand, he made it clear that he did not intend to occupy northern Vietnam. But he also declared that his government was allied to the US and was not opposed to the return of France. So Ho Chi Minh now had to deal with the Chinese and make sure that the Chinese don't just invite the French back to the north. The other headache for Ho Chi Minh was that accompanying the Chinese were the nationalist leaders of the VNQDD, Vu Hong Han, and of the Vietnamese Revolutionary Alliance, Nguyen Hai Thanh. These guys had stayed in China after the United Front in 1937 with Ho Chi Minh. They were now back, and they were counting on their Chinese protectors, either to overthrow Ho Chi Minh's government or force him to accept a coalition government if the United Front was to be maintained. Ho Chi Minh's assessments of these rivals were scathing, and he said that the nationalists were coming back home like fleas on a dog. And I've always wondered why the Chinese didn't simply overthrow Ho Chi Minh's and his governments and put their allies in power. I haven't read a clear answer to these questions anywhere, but it was perhaps because Ho Chi Minh had allies as well in the Kuomintang, that is Chiang Kai-shek's party, or perhaps because of Chiang Kai-shek's internal party dissensions. Who knows? But not only the Viet Minh stayed in power, but the Chinese occupation had another advantage. In the short term, it protected the DRV against an immediate French attack. With 150,000 Chinese soldiers on the ground, Leclerc could not just march on Hanoi or land in Haiphong. Ho Chi Minh was aware of it, so the Viet Minh worked hard to show his goodwill to the Chinese. Two examples. One, they stopped using the term Vietnamese Liberation Army for Vo Nguyen Giap forces and now called it a National Guard. Ho Chi Minh went so far as to announce with grandeur the dissolution of the Communist Party of Indochina, saying bombastically, quote, "Vietnam is my party." But the party continued to function behind the scenes, of course. Let's be serious here. So the Chinese left Ho Chi Minh's fledgling nation-state intact. What they got busy doing, though, was to extract as much spoil as they could from occupied Vietnam. At the top of the pyramid, General Lu Han appropriated all the weapons, equipment, and goods previously held by the Japanese, and he sold them to the highest bidder. His officers engaged in racketeering of all kinds, and soldiers held Vietnamese families to ransom, robbing them of their food supplies, equipment, chickens, pigs, you name it. People referred to them as locusts because of their voracity they showed in pillaging everything. Mai Elliott, author of The Sacred Willow, for example, recounts how a detachment of 50 Chinese soldiers requisitioned her family home, herded by force the family upstairs, and took over the ground floor. As a result, the Chinese occupation worsened the famine that had been raging for a year. Let's talk now about how Ho Chi Minh dealt with his Viet nationalist enemies. The Viet Minh, first of all, managed to hold them off by letting the Chinese warlords have their way. But of course, the Vietnamese nationalists were now protected by the Chinese, and they could flex their muscles openly. That's why armed clashes happen often in Hanoi and throughout northern Vietnam between the Viet Minh on one hand and the Dai Viet and VNQDD militias on the other hand. The Chinese had to intervene often and put pressure on all factions to calm things down. However, skirmishes continued. And when the Viet Minh announced that election would be held at the end of 1945, the nationalist parties said no thanks. Why? Well, they knew that the Viet Minh would win those elections handsomely, given that they themselves had just arrived and had no strong electoral base. But elections had to be held, and they could not stall forever. At the end, the Chinese brokered a deal between Vietnamese parties. Parliamentary elections would be finally held in January 1946. That was a win for the Viet Minh. But the Chinese put two conditions for the elections to take place. First, nationalist parties had to be given ministerial positions in the DRV government. And secondly, 70 seats in the future parliament were to be set aside for Vietnamese nationalist parties that were not communists. Unsurprisingly, the Viet Minh won the elections hands down. By the way, Citizen Vinh III, aka ex-Emperor Bao Dai, was even elected on the Viet Minh ticket. Ho Chi Minh could now point to an electoral victory to justify his hold on power. However, he now had to appoint nationalist ministers and deal with them in the parliament as well. And that was exactly how the Chinese wanted it. They wanted to give a head start to the anti-Viet Minh parties because they were preparing their withdrawal from Vietnam. In early 1946, the Chinese signed a withdrawal agreement with the French, and they didn't want to see a Vietnamese civil war break out before they left. They knew that their protégé did not stand a chance in the fight against a more structured, more politically astute, and simply more popular Viet Minh. So they chose to leave the Viet Minh in place, but imposed the VNQDD and the Dai Viet on the Viet Minh. And at a time when the Chinese locusts were on the move, Ho Chi Minh was forced to share power with the nationalist fleas. But we'll finish today with other worries that Ho Chi Minh had as well to deal with. Firstly, the economy was in tatters. Famine was still going on in some areas, and Ho Chi Minh's government did not have any money at all. That money, he needed it to equip Zap's National Guards, the numbers of which had swollen to 50,000 soldiers. Problem was, there was no money for equipment. So the Viet Minh did not have any means to defend itself against the French Expeditionary Corps if the French attacked. In fact, as early as October 1945, seeing the rapid gains made by Leclerc and Gracie in the south, Ho Chi Minh had realized that the French would make short work of his army. So, with no military power, Ho Chi Minh could have counted on political protections from overseas. But on the international stage, no country recognized the legitimacy of the DRV. Ho Chi Minh continued to send letters to the new US President Truman, but Truman never bothered to answer. The US neutrality was in fact a green light for France to retake Indochina. On the Soviet side, Stalin did not trust Ho Chi Minh. He found the guy not internationalist enough and too close to the Americans. Even Maurice Thorez, leader of the French Communist Party, which was the biggest party in France after World War II, even Torres did not support the DRV, declaring that he had no intention of, quote, liquidating France's position in Indochina, end quote. So with no international support, with increasing Chinese hostility towards the DRV, with domestic opposition on the rise, with no money to run the country, and with a very weak army, what could Ho Chi Minh do? Well, in the beginning of 1946, he came to a sobering and surprising conclusion that we'll talk about in the next episode. The conclusion was that there was no option for his government but to seek a negotiated settlement with France. Ho Chi Minh reckoned that if he played his hand right, he maybe could win official recognition for his government. Of course, this angered many in his party. But Ho Chi Minh insisted that the priority was to get rid of the Chinese, because he said last time they came, the Chinese stayed 1,000 years. Moreover, he added for his comrades, the VNKDD and the Dai Viet were taking advantage of the Chinese presence to challenge Viet Minh's preeminence. It was better to put up with France for a while. So next week, we'll talk about the agreement that Ho Chi Minh signed on March the 6th, 1946 with France. We will try to understand the ulterior motives and the ambiguities of the signatories, as both France and the DRV saw the agreement not as a final settlement, but simply a necessary step before they could get what they wanted. Until then, take care and see you next time.